His name in Nahuatl, Cuauhtémoc, means descending eagle or eagle that strikes downward, the image of a bird of prey folding its wings and diving toward the earth at full speed. It was a name given at birth, before anyone could know how perfectly it would describe his life. He was the last ruler of the Aztec Empire, and his story is one of the most devastating in the history of the Americas. A record of extraordinary courage meeting an overwhelming force that left no room for anything except the manner in which a man chose to fall. A prince in the last years of a world. Cuauhtémoc was born between approximately 1495 and 1502, into the highest tier of Aztec aristocracy. His father was the Tlatoani Xiuhcatl, he was a cousin of Moctezuma II. From childhood he was educated in the Calmecac, the school reserved for the nobility, where young men studied religion, astronomy, rhetoric, law, and the arts of war. It was an education designed to produce rulers, generals, and priests, men who understood the Aztec world as a complete system, sacred and political at once. When Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast in 1519, Cuauhtémoc held the position of ruler of Tlatelolco, the great market city that was Tenochtitlan's twin, the commercial heart of the empire. He was perhaps 20 years old. And from the first reports of the stranger's arrival, he understood what Moctezuma II did not, or could not bring himself to accept, that the men coming from the sea were not gods. They were conquerors. And they intended to stay. The night of sorrows and the throne nobody wanted. Cuauhtémoc was among the leaders of the uprising of June 1520. The moment when the Aztec population of Tenochtitlan, enraged by the Spanish occupation of their capital and by Moctezuma's apparent submission to it, drove the conquistadors out of the city by force. The Spanish called this night the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Cortés lost most of his army, most of his artillery, and most of the gold he had accumulated, fighting his way across the causeways in darkness while Aztec warriors attacked from canoes on both sides. It seemed, for a moment, like a victory. But the same ships that had brought the Spanish had also brought something invisible and incomprehensible, smallpox. The disease moved through the densely populated island city with catastrophic speed. Moctezuma was dead, killed in circumstances that remain disputed, either by the Spanish or by his own people. His successor Cuitlahuac, who had helped organize the uprising, contracted smallpox and died after approximately 80 days in power. The empire had lost 2 rulers in months, and Cortés was already regrouping. In early 1521, the Council of Elders chose Cuauhtémoc as the new Tlatoani. He was in his early 20s. The city he was inheriting was already under blockade. The causeways that connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland were contested. The lake that had once been the empire's greatest defensive asset was about to become its prison. The siege, 80 days of the end of the world. Cortés had spent the months after the Noche Triste rebuilding his force and, crucially, rebuilding his alliances. The Tlaxcalans, a people who had resisted Aztec domination for generations and who had reason to hate the empire far more than they feared the Spanish, provided the bulk of his army. Contemporary estimates suggest Cortés commanded somewhere between 700 and 900 Spanish soldiers and as many as 150,000 to 200,000 indigenous allies. Against this force, Tenochtitlan's population, reduced by smallpox, cut off from resupply, defending an island, had perhaps 300,000 people, of whom a fraction were warriors. Cuauhtémoc understood the geometry of the problem. He ordered the causeways fortified and the bridges destroyed, denying the Spanish the flat, open ground where cavalry and artillery were most effective. He sent runners to every corner of the empire, offering the abolition of tribute in exchange for military reinforcement. He organized a fleet of war canoes to contest Cortés's brigantines on the lake. He arranged night raids against the Spanish encampments. He fought, in short, the only war available to him, a defensive war of attrition, buying time, hoping that something, disease, supply failure, political collapse among the allies, would break the siege from the outside. Nothing broke it. Cortés advanced methodically, destroying the city as he went. The Aztec urban landscape. The temples, the palaces, the floating gardens of Tlatelolco, the great market where tens of thousands traded every day, was demolished building by building, the rubble pushed into the canals to create paths for horses and cannon. The aqueduct from Chapultepec was cut. The city ran out of fresh water. It ran out of food. The population ate bark, roots, and leather. They drank the salt water of the lake. They buried their dead in the courtyards of houses and kept fighting. Cuauhtémoc rejected every offer of negotiation. Cortés sent multiple messages, through intermediaries, through captured warriors, through priests, offering terms if the city surrendered. The answer was always no. Warriors who had been taken prisoner and returned with Spanish proposals were sometimes killed by their own people for even carrying the message. The refusal was not irrational. The fate of populations that resisted and then surrendered elsewhere in the conquest was not generally better than the fate of those who died fighting. The last day. By August 13, 1521, Tenochtitlan had effectively ceased to exist as a city. What remained was a field of rubble, corpses, and a shrinking pocket of survivors in Tlatelolco, Cuauhtémoc's own district, the last ground that had not yet been taken. The population that had not died of starvation, disease, or combat was trapped on a few blocks of ruined buildings surrounded by water and enemies. Cuauhtémoc made a decision that reflected his understanding of what was left to him. Not surrender, he had refused that for 80 days. But he could not save the city. He could potentially save himself, and from safety he could organize the resistance that the jungles and mountains of the empire's remaining territories might sustain. He boarded a canoe with his family and closest advisors and attempted to cross the lake. A Spanish brigantine intercepted the canoe. Its commander, Garcia Holguin, recognized the quality of the passengers. Cuauhtémoc identified himself and asked only one thing: to be taken to Cortés. When they met, the two men who had been fighting each other across the ruins of the greatest city in the Americas, Cuauhtémoc reportedly placed his hand on the dagger at Cortés's belt and said, "I have done everything in my power to defend my city and my people. I can do no more. Take this blade and kill me with it now." Cortés embraced him and promised his life. The promise lasted 4 years. Fire on the feet. The problem with the conquest of Tenochtitlan was that the conquerors had expected more gold. The treasure that Moctezuma had shown Cortés on his first arrival, the accumulation of generations of imperial tribute, was largely gone. Most of it had been lost on the Noche Triste, thrown into the lake by retreating soldiers too exhausted to carry it, recovered by no one. What remained in the ruined city was a fraction of what the Spanish crown and the soldiers who had survived the siege believed they were owed. The pressure on Cortés from his own men and from royal officials was significant and sustained. Where was the gold? Where had the Aztecs hidden it? Cuauhtémoc had been in the capital during its final months. He must know. Cortés, who had made promises of mercy, eventually sanctioned what his officers had been demanding: torture. Cuauhtémoc and Tlalpanquetzal, the ruler of Tlacopan, were held down. Their feet were coated with oil and held over burning coals. The interrogation continued until the examiners were satisfied they had learned everything available to learn, which was, in the end, very little. Cuauhtémoc's answer was that the remaining treasures had been thrown into the deep sections of the lake before the city fell. Whether this was true, or a last act of denial, has never been established. The lake has been drained. The gold, if it exists, has not been found. What is recorded is the exchange between Cuauhtémoc and Tlalpanquetzal during the torture. When Tlalpanquetzal groaned and seemed about to speak, Cuauhtémoc looked at him and said, in the phrase that every Mexican schoolchild learns, "¿Acaso estoy yo en algún delito o baño?" Am I, then, lying on a bed of roses? He did not speak again on the subject. The torture left him unable to walk normally for the rest of his life. The march to Honduras and the tree. For the 3 years following the fall of Tenochtitlan, Cuauhtémoc existed in a strange intermediate state. Nominally a prisoner, but kept alive and relatively visible because his presence helped prevent new uprisings among the indigenous population. The Spanish understood that executing the last Aztec ruler too quickly would create a martyr. Keeping him alive created a symbol of defeat. They used him as a political instrument while stripping him of all actual authority. In 1524, Cortés launched an expedition to Honduras. A brutal overland march through some of the most difficult terrain in Mesoamerica, to suppress a rebellion by one of his own captains, Cristobal de Olid. He took Cuauhtémoc and the other surviving indigenous lords with him rather than leave them in Mexico City unsupervised. The journey through the swamps and jungles of the Yucatan was agonizing for everyone. Men and horses died of exhaustion, fever, and starvation. The expedition that had conquered an empire was being destroyed by jungle and distance. Somewhere in the region of Tabasco, near a settlement called Atzamcanac, Cortés received information from a converted indigenous man, an informant whose motivations and reliability are impossible now to assess, that Cuauhtémoc and the other lords were planning to kill the Spanish during a river crossing and raise a general uprising across the region. There is no independent evidence that such a conspiracy existed. The evidence consisted entirely of one man's account, possibly obtained under pressure, possibly motivated by private grievances. Cortés, exhausted, isolated, and increasingly paranoid after months in the jungle, convened a summary proceeding. Cuauhtémoc denied everything. He said that the conversations reported as conspiracy were discussions of the hardships of the march, of hunger, sickness, and the deaths of men and animals. He asked what evidence existed beyond the word of a single informant. There was none. On February 28, 1525, Cuauhtémoc and Tetelpanquetzal were hanged, some sources say from a ceiba tree, the sacred tree of Mesoamerican cosmology, others say from a poplar or wooden gallows. Before the execution, Cuauhtémoc was baptized as Don Hernando de Alvarado Cuauhtémoc, a Christian name applied in the final minutes of a life he had spent defending everything that name was designed to replace. His last recorded words, addressed to Cortés, were, "O Malinche, I knew for many days that your words were false, and that you kept me alive only to bring me to such a death. Why do you kill me without justice? God will demand this injustice from you." Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who had been present at the siege of Tenochtitlan and who wrote the most detailed first-hand account of the conquest, recorded that the execution was considered unjust by many of the Spanish soldiers present. It cast a shadow over the expedition and over Cortés's reputation that his contemporaries noted and that historians have not forgotten. The emperor who never died. In the construction of modern Mexican national identity, Cuauhtémoc occupies a place that has no precise equivalent in European history. He is not simply a historical figure or a military hero. He is the foundational martyr of the nation. The point at which indigenous Mexico and colonial Spain collided most violently and most irreversibly, and the human being who, by refusing to yield, preserved something that conquest could not reach. After Mexican independence in 1821, the new state needed a history that was neither purely Spanish nor purely pre-Columbian, a narrative that could encompass both the indigenous past and the mixed-race present. Cuauhtémoc became the central figure of that narrative. The last ruler of the Old World, who died rather than betray it, and whose death was therefore also a kind of birth. The Mexico that emerged from the conquest was not the Mexico he had defended. But it carried something of him in its memory. The monument to Cuauhtémoc at the intersection of Paseo de la Reforma and Insurgentes in Mexico City, erected in 1887, shows him not as a defeated prisoner but as a standing warrior, spear in hand, looking toward the horizon. His name appears on streets, metro stations, schools, and naval vessels throughout the country. Diego Rivera painted him in the murals of the National Palace as the central figure of pre-Columbian civilization. David Alfaro Siqueiros depicted his torture as a symbol not of defeat but of the permanent resistance of colonized peoples, a martyrdom that accused the colonial project rather than commemorating its success. There is a saying in Mexico, Cuauhtémoc is the only emperor who never died. It means that the thing he represented, the refusal to break, the insistence on dignity when everything else has been taken, did not end when he was hanged from a tree in the jungles of Tabasco in 1525. It survived into the country that was built on the ruins of his world, and it survives still, in the name that translates as eagle that strikes downward, and that has never, in 5 centuries, stopped striking.